My name is Sister Callista Evely, and I died on a cold morning in March of 2023. I was 72 years old, and I had served as a cloistered nun for more than 50 years in the Order of St. Joseph the Silent Heart, tucked away in a secluded abbey on the outskirts of Carmel, Indiana. My life was routine, disciplined, and marked by service to the church. I had taken my vows as a young girl just barely out of high school, enamored with the peace and beauty I saw in the older sisters. Over the years, I grew accustomed to the rhythm of convent life. Early morning prayers, silent meals, rosaries said in unison, days punctuated by sacraments, confession, Eucharist, and obedience to our superiors. I wore my habit with reverence. I loved the sacred stillness of the chapel at midnight. I believed I was living a holy life, one worthy of heaven. I truly did. So when my body began to decline, and the doctors informed us that I had late-stage congestive heart failure, I received the news with solemn peace. I had lived for God, or so I believed. Death didn't scare me. In fact, I welcomed it with a quiet expectation, imagining angels would carry me straight to eternal rest. I remember the moment it happened, though I had no sense that death had come. I had been in the infirmary of our abbey, lying in bed, Sister Martha holding my hand and reading softly from a psalter. A sudden wave of warmth washed over me, and I could feel my limbs loosening, the ache in my chest fading. Then, without warning, I felt as if I were slipping backward into a vast expanse of silence, like falling into water without a splash. I opened my eyes, but I was no longer in my body. I was standing barefoot in what I can only describe as a realm between realms. Everything around me shimmered, not with light in the natural sense, but with something alive, colors I had never seen before and couldn't begin to name. It felt as though I was wrapped in a sacred presence, and yet the air held tension. I expected to see angels or saints rushing to greet me, but instead, I stood alone in the hush. A low hum filled the atmosphere, pulsing like a heartbeat just beyond my hearing. I began to walk, though there was no ground, no visible path, and the light around me seemed to respond to my thoughts, brightening and dimming with each feeling. Time didn't exist. There was no age, no pain, no ticking of the clock, but I still felt uncertain. I called out in my spirit, "Jesus?" but the name came out more like a cry than a prayer. I expected warmth. I expected embrace. But what came was different. Suddenly, I was no longer alone. A presence, vast and overwhelming, approached. I couldn't see a face, only a radiance that made everything inside me fall silent. I felt exposed, not judged harshly, but laid bare. This was no soft, comforting encounter. This was truth. Every layer of pretense, every veil of ritual or religious practice that had clothed my life fell away in an instant. The light seemed to pierce through my soul, and I fell to my knees without realizing I had even moved. The presence spoke, not with lips, but directly into the depths of my being. A voice I knew was Jesus, the same Jesus I had worshipped, studied, prayed to. But the voice was not what I had expected. It was both grief-stricken and full of holy authority. He said, "You followed the church, but you did not follow me." Those words shattered everything I believed about my life. My prayers, my service, my decades in the convent. They all flashed before my eyes, like a river of memories suddenly surging through a broken dam. I saw myself kneeling in the pews, repeating novenas, cleaning chalices with reverent hands, obeying Mother Superior with quiet submission. I saw myself reciting the rosary dozens of times a day, attending Mass without fail, fasting, confessing, and living by the rule. And yet, in each scene, I saw something missing. I never once asked Jesus, "What do you want from me today?" I never invited him to speak into my heart. I assumed that being devout meant I was righteous. But now, under his gaze, I realized I had known of him, studied him, spoken about him, sung about him, but I had never truly known him. He showed me scenes I had forgotten. A young novice had once approached me, weeping in the garden, questioning her faith. I had handed her a catechism instead of comforting her with the love of Christ. I watched myself turning away from broken people, afraid their emotions might disturb the convent's order. I remembered a woman who visited once, pleading for spiritual help after her daughter's suicide. I gave her a prayer card and told her I would offer masses for her, but I didn't truly sit with her pain. The moments played out like echoes in a canyon, each one ringing with hollow ritual. Your heart was close to doctrine, but far from me, Jesus said again, and this time I felt it like a knife, not in anger, but in truth. He showed me the times I had spoken of mercy, yet held bitterness towards sisters who disagreed with me. He revealed how I had clung to the rule book, mistaking spiritual control for spiritual maturity. I thought silence equaled holiness. I thought obedience equaled intimacy. But I had never once let Jesus interrupt my structure. I had never once knelt before him and simply wept, or sat in stillness long enough to hear his voice behind the veil of routine. I tried to defend myself in my spirit. I wanted to cry out, "But I loved you. I served you. I gave you my life." But the words felt empty in that space. I knew they were shaped more by my assumptions than by truth. I realized I had built my life around a system that kept Jesus at a distance. I didn't sin outwardly, but I also never gave him my heart. My prayers had become rehearsed. My worship had become programmed. My good works, while visible, were done more from duty than desire. There was no intimacy in my walk, only imitation. And yet, even in the crushing truth of that realization, I felt no condemnation from him, only sorrow, as if Jesus himself wept for me, not because he hated me, but because he had loved me deeply and I had missed the invitation to know him personally. I thought I had spent a lifetime preparing for heaven, but I had never stopped to ask the King of Heaven what he truly wanted from me. I had been a bride in name, but not in intimacy, a servant in habit, but not in love. Jesus said one final thing before everything around me began to shift. "Because your soul still longed for truth, you will return. But speak of what you saw, not with fear, but with fire." And then, without warning, I felt myself falling, downward, backward, into a body that felt unfamiliar. I gasped awake in the infirmary bed, nurses and sisters rushing toward me, calling my name in disbelief. I had been dead for nearly 6 minutes, but now I was alive. Something had changed in me, something eternal. The fire he spoke of now flickered inside my chest, and I knew in my soul, my life, my faith, Everything I thought I knew had to be reborn. The days that followed my return were a blur of physical weakness and spiritual intensity. I lay in my small infirmary bed, my body trembling, my breath shallow, yet something inside me had been awakened, a deep stirring that neither the sisters nor the doctors could fully understand. They called it a miracle, and perhaps it was. But the greater miracle wasn't that I had come back from death. It was that I had come back knowing I had never truly lived. I remained silent at first, afraid to speak aloud the things I had seen and heard. My lips could form words, but my heart trembled beneath the weight of truth. I had not only glimpsed the reality of eternity, I had tasted the sorrow of Jesus Christ, felt his grief over a church that had forgotten his voice, and now I carried that sorrow like a burning coal inside my chest. The other sisters visited me often, bringing soup, offering prayers, and speaking gentle encouragement. Their kindness pierced me in unexpected ways, because I now saw them not as holy women set apart, but as souls, each on a narrow road, many walking in the same illusion I once walked. When they prayed beside me, I listened not only to their words, but to their hearts. And I heard in them what I had once heard in myself: routine without fire, devotion without encounter, obedience without relationship. I wanted to scream, not in anger, but in grief. I wanted to grab their hands and say, "He's real. He's alive. He's not just an idea or a statue. He's longing to know you." But I couldn't find the courage. Not yet. On the third night, I asked for solitude. I turned away food and visitors, and as the sky outside darkened, I knelt beside the window, looking out over the snowy garden. I folded my hands, not in habit, but in desperation. I whispered the name, Jesus, and for the first time in my life, I meant it as a plea, not a performance. I wept. Tears that had been locked away by decades of piety flowed down my cheeks in silence. I told him I was sorry, not just for what I had done, but for what I had not done, for never seeking him with all my heart, for hiding behind veils and rules and holy garments instead of crawling into his arms like a child. In that moment, something beautiful happened. A peace descended, not the peace of routine or religious satisfaction, but a living peace. It filled the room like a fragrance, and I felt him there, not in a vision, not in a voice, but in a presence so real I dared not move. I remained kneeling until dawn, not saying much, just resting in the truth that Jesus had come, not to shame me, but to begin again. In the weeks that followed, I began to change. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. I found myself rising in the early hours, not just to say morning prayers, but to sit in stillness, to listen. And sometimes when I heard nothing, I still stayed there, because I had come to know that love is not always loud. I read scripture not as a duty, but as a letter from someone who longed to speak into my soul. The words leapt from the page, especially the Gospels. I saw Jesus in ways I had never seen before, not just the man who healed and taught, but the friend who wept, who called people by name, who dined with sinners, who rebuked religious leaders not because they were disciplined, but because they were distant from his heart. Then came the day when I could no longer stay silent. It began with a young postulant named Sister Amelia, who had joined our order only 6 months earlier. She was bright-eyed, zealous, always eager to do what was right. One afternoon, She came to me in the infirmary to bring tea. She knelt beside me and asked softly, "Sister Callista, were you afraid when you died?" I looked into her eyes and saw in them the very same hunger I had once buried under duty. I took her hand, and without thinking, I told her everything. The tunnel, the light, the sorrow in Jesus' eyes. The words, "You followed the church, but you didn't follow me." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I feared I had said too much. But instead of shock, I saw something else. Understanding. Her lips trembled as she said, "I felt that too, like I'm doing all the right things, but I still feel distant. I thought it was just me." I embraced her. That night, we prayed together, not with scripted prayers, but with open hearts. It was the first time I had truly prayed with someone, not at them, not over them, but with them. I realized then that God was not calling me to destroy the church, but to awaken it from within. Word spread slowly. Some sisters asked to hear my story. Others avoided me, unsure what to think. A few, especially older ones, warned me to stop speaking of private revelation. But I had tasted truth, and I could not untaste it. The fire that Jesus placed in me burned too deeply now. I began speaking not only within the convent, but at neighboring parishes. I was granted permission, surprisingly, by the Archdiocese to share my testimony as long as I did so in accordance with the teachings of the Church. I agreed, because nothing I said violated doctrine, only exposed what doctrine without love becomes a shell. As I stood in those churches, staring into the eyes of people who had grown weary of religion, I saw something extraordinary. Hunger. There were those who had gone through the motions for years, confessing sins without repentance, receiving communion without communion, attending Mass without truly encountering Christ. And when I told them that I too had walked that path, that I too had mistaken obedience for intimacy, they listened. Some wept, some left in silence. A few came up afterward, asking for prayer, not out of routine, but out of desperation. Not everyone was pleased, of course. A letter arrived one day from a theologian who claimed I was endangering souls by discouraging sacramental life. But he misunderstood. I was not discarding the sacraments. I was saying they must be rooted in relationship. Communion without love is just bread. Confession without sorrow is just noise. Rosaries without trust are just beads. What I saw in that place beyond death was not that the church is wrong, but that it must be alive. Jesus didn't come to give us rituals. He came to give us himself. I thought often of that moment in the afterlife when I saw the souls of priests and nuns who had believed their garments would save them. Their screams still echoed in my heart. "But I sang for you. But I wore the collar." And the reply that shattered me. "But you didn't know me." I promised Jesus I would never let my story grow cold, that I would tell it again and again until my final breath. Because the church is beautiful when it is alive, when it breathes with the Spirit, when it loves with reckless honesty, when it places Jesus, not habit, not heritage, not hierarchy, at the center of everything. This was only the beginning of my return to earth, but already the path ahead was clear. I had not just been revived. I had been sent. Not long after I began sharing my testimony publicly, the walls of comfort I had known for so many years began to tremble. I suppose I expected applause, or at least quiet approval. After all, I was a nun, respected, long-standing, gentle by nature. But I quickly learned that spiritual truth doesn't always win you friends, especially when it threatens the illusion that everything is fine. At first, the letters came quietly, slipped under my door, or sent to the convent anonymously. Notes from parishioners, other religious sisters, even priests, some expressing awe and gratitude, others veiled with concern or polite resistance. "Your intentions are good," one read, "but be cautious about stirring confusion in the faithful." Another asked pointedly, "Who are you to claim you saw hell? Are you placing your personal experience above church teaching?" I read every word carefully, not with offense, but with sorrow. I understood their fear. I had once shared it. Change feels like chaos to those who have built their lives upon structure. But I was not here to bring chaos. I was here to sound the alarm. I began visiting other convents. I was invited to speak at a retreat center for lay women. There, among women whose lives were full of grocery lists, marriages, parenting, jobs, and ordinary responsibilities, I saw more spiritual hunger than I had in some monasteries. They weren't interested in rituals or rules. They were thirsty for encounter. Many came to me afterward with tears. One woman confessed, "I pray every day, but I don't know if I've ever heard his voice." Another said, "I go to church out of duty, but I don't feel close to him. I thought that meant I was just a bad Catholic." In those moments, I told them what I had come to understand. Feeling distant from God doesn't always mean you're failing. Sometimes it means you've never been taught how to draw near. We've been given beautiful tools, sacraments, liturgy, traditions, but tools are meant to build relationship, not replace it. Without the presence of Christ, even the holiest routines become empty. I had lived that emptiness, and now I was desperate to make sure others did not. Yet as the months passed, the resistance grew stronger. A high-ranking diocesan official summoned me to a meeting. He was polite but firm. He reminded me that personal revelations must be treated with caution, that no one is permitted to suggest that the Church's traditions are insufficient. I sat in his office, listening with respect, but my heart burned within me. I knew I wasn't attacking the Church. I was pleading for it to wake up. Still, I promised him I would remain within bounds, and I meant it. I had no desire to rebel, only to revive. That night, I went back to my little room in the convent and cried. I felt torn between obedience and urgency, between humility and boldness. I opened my Bible, which had become more than a book to me now. It was alive, pulsing with the breath of God. I turned to John 10, and the words pierced me. "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." That was the missing piece. We had taught people to listen to homilies, to confess their sins, to receive communion, but had we taught them to hear his voice? I thought again of the vision Jesus gave me. The line of clergy who stood weeping in the outer realms of eternity. Souls who had given their lives to the Church, but not to Christ. One priest clutched his breviary and sobbed, "I prayed every hour." Another whispered, "I preached to thousands." And yet the answer to each was the same. "You never knew me." It haunted me. One Sunday, I was invited to speak at a youth mass in a nearby parish. The church was packed, mostly teens and young adults, seated with arms crossed, phones buzzing in their laps, faces half engaged. I stood at the pulpit and told them the truth. Not with drama, not with condemnation, but with raw honesty. I spoke of my years in the convent, how I had loved the routine, the silence, the reverence, but how I had missed the very heart of it all. I told them about the moment Jesus looked at me and said, "You followed the church, but you didn't follow me." There was a hush in the room. Some looked up. Others cried. I ended by asking a question I now ask everywhere I go. Do you know him?
I don't mean know about him.
I mean, do you know him? That single question has become my fire. Because if we don't know him, if we're not walking with him daily, listening, repenting, trusting, then no amount of religion will save us. After the Mass, a boy named Thomas came up to me. He couldn't have been more than 16. He said, "I've gone to Catholic school my whole life, but I've never prayed for my heart. I didn't even think it mattered." I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "It matters more than anything." Slowly, my ministry grew. People started coming to our convent just to speak with me. Some were Catholics who had walked away. Others were still practicing, but dry and disillusioned. Many were clergy, priests who confessed they felt disconnected, unsure how to shepherd a flock when their own hearts felt far from the shepherd. I never claimed to have all the answers. I only shared what I knew, that Jesus is real, and that he wants our hearts more than he wants our habits. One evening, I received a call from a bishop in a southern diocese. He had read my story online and asked if I would come speak at a private clergy retreat. I agreed, nervously. When I arrived, I stood before 50 priests and a few deacons. Some looked skeptical, others curious. I told them the truth again, even though my hands trembled. I spoke of Jesus' sorrow, of the nun who thought she was saved because of her discipline, only to find that her discipline had become a wall instead of a doorway. I could feel the tension in the room, but I also saw tears. Afterward, one priest approached me and whispered, "Sister, I'm afraid. I preach, I serve, I pray, but sometimes I wonder, have I ever really heard him?" I looked him in the eyes and said, "Then start today." That night, I returned to my room and prayed long into the early hours. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. The more I spoke, the more opposition would rise. But I had made a vow now, one deeper than my original vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. I had vowed to Jesus himself that I would never again mistake form for fire, that I would walk with him, not just for him, that I would lead others, not to a pew, but to his presence. And slowly, something began to happen. Not a revival in the traditional sense, no sweeping movements, no massive conversions, but something deeper, hidden, personal, a quiet stirring in souls all over. Men and women who had grown up religious but had never known how to reach past the ritual were now beginning to wake up. They started opening their Bibles, praying without a script, listening, and in those small awakenings, I saw the flame of the church rekindling. It was no longer enough for me to say I had seen Jesus. Now I lived to make him known. The more I shared what had happened to me, the more I realized how few people truly understood the difference between religion and relationship. They nodded when I spoke of Jesus. They agreed that faith was important. But so many had settled into a kind of spiritual autopilot, living day to day on a diet of rituals without intimacy, obedience without understanding. I had once lived that way too, cloaked in piety, but distant from the very person I claimed to serve. Now that my eyes were open, I could see that same hollowness in others, hidden behind habits, titles, and robes. I remember one particular encounter that still haunts me. I had traveled to a monastery to speak with a group of cloistered nuns. It was a quiet place, austere and serene, with the air of timeless devotion. The women there were gracious and humble, many of them decades into their sacred vows. I shared my story carefully, not wanting to offend, but hoping to stir something deeper. After I spoke, an elderly sister approached me. Her voice trembled. "All these years," she whispered, "I've been afraid of God. Not because I don't love him, but because I never really knew how to talk to him outside the rules." Her words pierced me. I took her hand and said, "Then start now. Talk to him like he's right here. Because he is." That moment revealed something I hadn't fully grasped until then. Even in the most devout corners of the church, there are people who have never truly encountered the living Jesus. They serve him, they worship him, but they don't walk with him. And yet the hunger is there. Buried under years of formation and routine, there's a longing for something more, for someone real. One night, I sat in my room, reading the Gospel of Luke. The story of Martha and Mary drew tears from my eyes. I had always admired Martha, diligent, faithful, serving. But now, I saw myself in her restlessness. For so many years, I had been busy for God, but rarely still with him. I had labored in his name, but not always in his presence. And like Martha, I had missed the better portion. Mary chose relationship. She sat at his feet, listened, adored, loved. That was what he wanted from me, not my busyness, but my heart. And yet, despite these revelations, I still struggled. There were days when old habits pulled at me. I'd find myself slipping into rote prayers, checking boxes of obedience. It was hard to unlearn what I had built my entire identity around. Being a nun had been more than a role. It had been my life, my safety, my purpose. Now I was learning to live as something else entirely. A daughter, a friend, a bride of Christ, not in title alone, but in lived intimacy. The challenges didn't stop at the internal. Externally, my witness began to draw both praise and condemnation. Some in the church began to distance themselves. Invitations were revoked. A few superiors warned others about me, calling my message spiritually reckless or borderline Protestant. But others, especially the laity, began writing to me in secret. A young mother wrote, "I've gone to Mass my whole life, but I've never felt close to God. Your story gives me hope that I still can." A deacon confided, "I've been in ministry for 15 years, but I don't know how to pray unless I'm reading from a script. How do I start?" I told them the truth. Start small. Sit in silence. Open the Word. Speak to Jesus as if he were beside you. Then listen.
Wait.
Trust that he'll answer, not always in words, but in nudges, in peace, in conviction, in tears. I explained that relationship isn't built overnight. It takes surrender. It takes risk. It takes stripping away the layers of performance until what's left is a heart, naked and real, waiting to be held by the one who made it. Still, my own transformation wasn't without cost. I began to lose friendships I had cherished for decades. Some sisters in my former convent no longer wrote. Others sent me notes expressing concern that I was drifting into emotionalism, that I had let one experience rewire my theology. But how could I explain that this wasn't about emotions or ideas? It was about a person I had met, a person who had spoken into the deepest recesses of my soul and burned away the lies I had lived under. There were nights I cried in bed, wondering if I had gone too far, wondering if I was being deceived. But every time the doubt crept in, I returned to that moment, when Jesus looked into my soul and said, "You followed the church, but you didn't follow me." It was not condemnation. It was invitation, and I could not betray it.
Not now.
Not ever. I began traveling more. Churches, prayer groups, retreats. I spoke in living rooms and cathedrals to crowds of 20 and crowds of hundreds. I never asked for money. I never promoted a ministry. I simply shared what I had seen, what I had learned, what I now lived. I told people that Jesus is not an idea or an icon. He is a person alive and waiting. I told them that hell is not reserved for the rebellious only, but for the religious who never bothered to know the one they claimed to serve. And everywhere I went, people wept. Old men who had served as altar boys, now wrinkled and disillusioned, admitted that they had never felt loved by God, only judged. Young women raised in Catholic schools said they had memorized prayers, but never learned how to pray. Even priests broke down, confessing that they had lost their fire years ago and didn't know how to find it again. One night, after speaking at a parish in Ohio, I sat with a young seminarian named Gabriel. He had tears in his eyes as he asked, "Sister, is it too late for me to learn intimacy with Christ? I've spent years studying theology, but I don't know how to talk to him without a formula." I smiled and said, "Gabriel, if you're asking that question, it means you're ready. Start today, right now." I watched him bow his head, his lips trembling, and for the first time in his life, he prayed, not from a textbook, not from memory, but from the rawness of his own heart. That moment was worth every loss I had endured. The journey had become clear. My mission was not to criticize the church, but to call it back to its first love. To remind it that before we were Catholics, we were Christians. Before we belonged to a system, we belonged to a Savior. Before we had catechisms, we had the voice of the shepherd calling us by name. And I would not rest until every pew, every pulpit, every parish remembered that truth. As the months turned into a year, my path became both clearer and lonelier. I had begun this journey thinking I would find companions among the faithful, those who, like me, were awakened from religious slumber. And in some ways, I had. I met believers whose hunger for Jesus burned like wildfire, whose eyes lit up when I spoke of his love, whose hearts trembled at the mention of his voice. But for every soul I found yearning for truth, I encountered many more clinging to forms and fearing change. There was something about the message that offended people deeply, especially those who had built their identity on religious consistency. "Are you saying everything I've done for God is meaningless?" they would ask. "Are you saying sacraments don't matter?" I never said that. I never dismissed the beauty or value of the church's traditions. But I couldn't pretend anymore that they were enough. The rituals were holy, yes, but only when they were vessels, not substitutes. And too often, they had become replacements for real surrender. I wasn't attacking the church. I was pleading with it to wake up before it was too late. I was invited one evening to speak at a university chapel, a prestigious Catholic institution known for its intellectual rigor. The audience was filled with seminarians, professors, nuns, and young students. I stood before them, trembling, because I knew the cost of honesty in a place like this. I told them everything about my death, about Jesus, about the judgment I never expected, about the mercy that shocked me even more than the warning. When I finished, silence filled the room. Not applause, not tears, just silence. A faculty member stood up, thanked me politely, and ushered me away. I never heard from them again. The rejection stung, but I understood. My message wasn't designed to flatter. It wasn't meant to entertain. It was a sword, piercing, dividing, exposing. And that kind of truth, though wrapped in love, is rarely welcomed. Still, I kept going, because in my quiet moments with the Lord, I sensed His pleasure. I felt His delight, not because I was bold, but because I was faithful. He had saved me from a terrible destiny, and all I wanted now was to save others from the same fate. One night, I had a dream so vivid it left me weeping in the dark. In it, I was standing at the back of a church, watching a procession of clergy march toward the altar. They wore ornate vestments, carried polished chalices, and chanted with precision. But Jesus was nowhere among them. Instead, He stood outside the doors, knocking unseen. The people inside continued their rituals, oblivious. And then He turned and looked at me, not with anger, but with sorrow. That image burned into my spirit. I woke up with the words echoing in my heart. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. I began journaling every insight, every conversation, every encounter. I started recording videos, not for popularity, but for preservation. I wanted the message to outlive me. I was 73 now. I knew I didn't have forever, but I had today. And as long as I had breath, I would speak. One of the most profound encounters during that time came from a former priest who had left the clergy after a crisis of faith. He had seen my testimony online and reached out. We met in a quiet garden. He wore no collar, just a worn jacket and tired eyes. "I lost my faith," he confessed, "but your story shook something loose in me. Is it really possible to start again? After so many years of emptiness." I looked him in the eye and said, "If Jesus gave me another chance after death itself, then you, still breathing, still seeking, are already halfway home." He wept openly. The pain in the church wasn't limited to the pews. It reached into the very heart of the clergy. So many had been trained to perform, not commune. They had been taught to administer the sacraments, but not how to sit at Jesus' feet. They had been armed with doctrine, but left starving for love. And I, an old woman, once blinded by the same veil, was now their midwife into intimacy. But the resistance grew. Letters from dioceses warned me not to confuse the faithful. A few bishops accused me of undermining the magisterium. Even my former abbess publicly rebuked me in a Catholic newspaper. "This woman has abandoned her vow of obedience," she wrote. "She now walks a dangerous line between mysticism and heresy." I cried when I read it, not out of guilt, but grief. Grief for how blind we could be when our pride dressed itself in piety. One night, in prayer, I asked Jesus if I should stop. They don't want to hear it, I told him. They're turning on me. And I heard his voice, not aloud, but in that unmistakable place within. They didn't want to hear me either. I felt his nearness, his compassion. And then he whispered something that became the anchor of my mission. One soul. Just one. If you speak for 50 years and only one heart turns back to me, it was worth it. That renewed my fire. I returned to small gatherings, house churches, prayer groups, even online forums. I wasn't looking for platforms. I was looking for hearts. And oh, how many I found. A teenager who struggled with scrupulosity told me, "I thought God hated me until I heard your story." A young man caught in porn addiction confessed, "I kept going to confession, but I never changed. Now I realize I never knew Jesus, but I want to." Testimonies like those were my treasures. They reminded me that revival doesn't always look like packed stadiums or flashy sermons. Sometimes it looks like a kitchen table, a whispered prayer, a tear-stained Bible, a nun in her 70s telling a broken soul, "You are not too far gone. Jesus wants you." Even now, as I write these words from a modest apartment in Philadelphia, I know my time is drawing near. The Lord has not shown me when I will die, but I feel it. My body aches more. My steps are slower. But my spirit is more alive than it has ever been. And when that day comes, when I cross over for the final time, I know He'll be waiting, not as a judge with sorrow in His eyes, but as the bridegroom of my soul, arms open wide. This time, I won't be halted. I won't be sent back. This time, I'll fall into the embrace I was made for. But until then, I'll keep crying out in the wilderness, because there are still so many Marthas, so many Pharisees, so many religious hearts who've never tasted the joy of Jesus. And I've come back to tell them, there's more. The years pressed forward gently, like twilight drifting into dusk. My hair, now silver, hung in soft wisps around my face. My hands had become thin and veined, but they still moved with purpose as I turned the pages of Scripture each morning. I often sat by the small window in my apartment, watching the birds hop between branches in the tree outside. I found great comfort in their simple, obedient lives. No ritual, no ceremony, just instinctive trust in the one who made them. It had been nearly a decade since I returned from that place between life and eternity. A decade since Jesus interrupted my death and rerouted my soul. And though my life had grown quieter, it had never been more full. The noise of applause had long faded, replaced by the whisper of purpose. I was not famous, nor wealthy, nor even widely accepted, but I was faithful, and in the stillness, I felt His presence like never before. In the final months of my life, something unexpected happened. I began receiving letters, hundreds of them, from across the world. Handwritten notes from nuns in cloisters, priests in doubt, grandmothers who had spent their lives in pews but never felt known by God. Young people who stumbled across my testimony online and wept because they had finally found words for the emptiness they carried. One letter from a teenage girl in Argentina read, "Sister Callista, I was going to leave the church. I thought God didn't want someone like me, someone who struggled to believe. But then I saw your story, and I felt Jesus speak to me for the first time. I didn't know He wanted my heart more than my rituals. Thank you." I sat with that letter in my lap for an hour, tears falling into the ink. Another came from a man in his 60s who had served as a deacon for over 20 years. He confessed that his heart had grown numb from the repetition of duty. He wrote, "You taught me to pray again, not with books or formulas, just with honesty." Each letter was a soul, a story, and a reminder that the fire Jesus kindled in me had not burned in vain. It had spread quietly, like candlelight passing from wick to wick in a dark cathedral. And now, even as my body weakened, that flame kept reaching. One afternoon, while praying, I sensed the Lord speak again. This time it was different. Not a commission, not a rebuke, not even a call. Just a whisper. Soon. I understood. It would be soon. My breath was growing shorter. My nights were longer. I had begun dreaming of that garden again. The one I saw during my near-death experience. The one where Jesus stood waiting. In the dream, I never reached him, but he was always just ahead, beckoning, smiling with eyes full of eternity. And so I began preparing, not for death, but for home. I asked a dear friend to help record one final message. Just my voice, just truth. I wanted people to hear it, not through polished production or background music, but raw, real, and burning. In that recording, I said, "Don't wait until your body gives out to realize your soul was starving. Don't assume church attendance equals salvation. Don't confuse reverence with relationship. Jesus is not waiting for your performance. He's longing for your surrender." I asked them to search their hearts, to strip away the layers of tradition and ask one simple question. Do I know him? Not about him, not rituals concerning him, but him alive, speaking, walking beside them. I begged them, don't gamble eternity on religious habit. If you've never met the living Jesus, cry out for him now. He will come. And then I went silent. In my last days, I wasn't afraid. There was no dread, only peace. I had faced judgment and been embraced by mercy. I had been pulled from the edge of hell by the very one I thought I served. Now, at last, I would see him not as a sorrowful judge, but as the lover of my soul. On the final evening, I sat in bed with my Bible open and the moonlight pouring in. I smiled because I knew that before the sun rose, I would be with him. I whispered one last prayer, not for myself, but for you. Yes, you reading this, watching this, listening with your heart stirred. I prayed that you would not go another day without meeting Jesus for yourself, that you would not settle for secondhand faith or empty rituals, that you would throw yourself at his feet and say, "Here I am, not my religion, not my status, just me." And now, beloved one, it's your turn. Go to the comment section below and write your answer to this one question. Do I know Jesus personally? Not as a theory, not through tradition, but personally. If the answer is yes, praise him with boldness. If the answer is no, don't be ashamed. Write that too, and let others surround you in prayer. This isn't about judgment. It's about invitation. The doors of grace are still open, but one day they won't be. Don't wait until it's too late.
Comment now.
Confess, commit, or cry out, but whatever you do, don't stay silent. Jesus is listening, and so are we.